So this is from RF Hartwell over on the Reddit. Now, if I told you, what do you think more Americans do? Go to the movies or go to the library? Now, if you're like me, you're kind of likely to say, well, of course they go to the movies. However, according to this statistic, in 2019, that apparently wasn't the case. Check this out. In 2019, more Americans went to the library than to the movies. Yes, really. The U.S. film industry may have generated revenue somewhere in the region of $40 billion last year, but it seems Hollywood still has plenty of work to do if it wants to compete with the most hallowed of American institutions, the public library. Yes, according to a recent Gallup poll, visiting the local library remains by far the most common cultural activity Americans engage in. As reported earlier today by Justin McCarthy, and this is a couple days old, by the way, so it's not like today as of the recording of this, but visiting the library remains the most common cultural activity Americans engage in by far. The average 10.5 trips to the library U.S. adults report taking in 2019 exceeds their participation in 8 other common leisure activities. Americans attend live music or theatrical events and visit national or historical parks roughly 4 times a year on average, and visit museums and gambling casinos 2.5 times annually. Trips to amusement or theme parks 1.5 and zoos 0.9 are the least common activities on the list. Interesting. Very interesting. So, the optimists look at this. It's like, Americans really still care about their libraries. That's good, which of course it is. But let's kind of look at the more real view of this that I think is a factor. A lot of Americans can't afford to do more of these leisurely activities. A lot of people can't afford. A lot of people would probably go to the movies a lot more if they could afford it. Looking at the movies specifically, and I am what is known as an elder millennial. That's what I was dubbed on the Jimmy Dore show. So I'm at about the tail end of the millennial generation. I think there's a couple millennials that are older than me, but for the most part, I'm borderline Gen X. I'm at the kind of like the beginning slate of the millennial generation. When I was growing up, going to the movies was a much more affordable thing to do. Obviously, it costs less numerically as the dollar has, of course, changed. But even factoring that change of a dollar, and this is coming from someone who my interests have not changed all that much from my adolescent life until now. I have always really loved music. I still do. I like to attend live music. I also like going to the theater occasionally. I liked all those things even when I was younger. I did the musicals in high school. So my interests have not changed much. But when I was an adolescent, it was always a more affordable activity to go to the movie versus going to a show. And when I say show, I mean like a music show, like a rock show, a punk show, whatever. Typically, not all the time, but typically it was more affordable to go to the movies than go to something like that. If it was like a national act or something, if it was like a local show, well, that's different. If it was like a bunch of local bands, it was probably cheaper, or in some cases the same price. When I was an adolescent, a movie was about $8. That was the average price to go to a movie. It was $8 to go into the movie. A show would be around, sometimes it was as low as $5. It was also not uncommon for it to be more like $8. If it was a national act, it was more expensive. It was like 15 or so typically. So going like if a band I really like came to town, chances are that was a more expensive activity than going to the movies. I don't think that's the case anymore. Now, going to the movies is actually just as much as doing one of those other activities typically. Not all the time, but typically going to the movies is in the same price range as those things. That's why me personally, I don't care for going to the movies that much, because I'd rather spend that money going to see a live performance of sorts. I'd much rather see a band. I'd much rather go to the theater. I'd if it's something good. If it's something lame, then no. And I'm not a big musicals guy. I like some, but I'm not a big musical. I prefer like a play. Like I'm more of a play guy. Anyway, so I feel like even factoring in the currency of a dollar, like going to the movies is a more expensive activity, comparatively speaking, than it used to be. So you get what I'm saying. So I don't particularly like doing it that much. That is cool that a lot of Americans report going to the library at least 10 times a year. That ain't bad. I definitely do that. I don't know how many times, but I go to my library. I mean, I always have something from my library. So I'm going there at least, once or twice a month at least. So I guarantee I probably get, if I had to take a guess, I probably go to the library about 20 times a year. I definitely don't go to 20 movies a year. Nowhere close. Now, as far as like live performance, I'm sort of a weird statistic there because, I kind of do that for a job. So it's like, do my own shows count? And part of the reason I might not go to as much or might go to more is because, well, anyway, you get the idea. When you're touring nightclubs as part of what you do, does that count? Does that not count? I don't know. Obviously, if that counts, I probably do that more than anything else because, that's my job. But anyway, this is an interesting statistic. I think in some ways there's reason to be positive, but in other ways, it's also saying that, look, the library is free. These other things are not. And when we live in a country where about half the country can't even afford $1,000 emergency, and half the country is working 2 and 3 jobs just to survive, and people are dealing with crushing amounts of debt, yeah, it would make sense that they're not spending money on leisurely activities as much if something is free at the library. So, but I love libraries. I love my library. I'll always love libraries. And we cannot lose these important cultural institutions. So I'm happy that statistics like this are out there. So whenever they're considering slashing money from the libraries, which they do all the time, people can at least point to this and be like, hey, more Americans are using the library than going to the movies. We got to fund these things. So I'm glad the statistic's out there. I really am. So that's cool. Thank you for sharing that, RF Hartwell. Fun conversation.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your